Geo-blocking of audiovisual services. This one is sort of geo-blocking of everything else. Most of us will have experienced geo-blocking at one time or another. Perhaps you want to connect to a website, instead you get directed to a website in a different country than the one where you want it to be, or you can't get into the website at all. You're unable to make the purchase. You were almost able to make the purchase, but you can't get it shipped where you want. Or perhaps you were almost able to get it purchased and shipped, but couldn't pay for it. So there are lots of different forms, lots of different ways it can take place. This panel will be dealing largely with copyrighted materials, copyrighted services, and but also a bit with goods. The first speaker will be Professor Berten Martens of the Joint Research Center. He and his colleagues have done some quite important work on the socioeconomic benefits of a possible prohibition or of measures collectively that would address problems with geo-blocking. These were prominently cited in the Commission's impact assessment for the regulation that they proposed. The other speakers, just so you know who we have here, are Marina Elgrecci, the head of public policy at Spotify, who will be presenting a view from the digital music world. We have Fabian Pagemann. I'll introduce him in a bit more length just before they speak. He's the head of the EIBF, so he has an important trade association of booksellers, and is also the Retail Merchant of the Year in the Netherlands, if I'm not mistaken. And we also have Augustin Reina, who deals with these issues for BEUC, so he'll be presenting more of a consumer advocacy perspective. I'm expecting Mrs. Toon, a prominent member of the European Parliament, to come in time for closing remarks. So we have a full panel, and that will be the first panel. And with that, over to you, Mr. Martin, Dr. Martin, excuse me.
Does this work?
I certainly hope so.
They should load the slides.
Okay.
There we go.
Still doesn't move.
Well, point it in that direction.
I have to point it. Okay. 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 Thank you very much, Scott, for the introduction. So as Scott said, I work for the Joint Research Center, which is the Commission's in-house research organization, I would say. Over the last couple of years, we've done a lot of research on digital media, cross-border trade, cross-border access in digital media. And thank you for inviting me. Thank you to Bruegel for inviting me for this event, because it gives me an opportunity to present at least some of the work that we've done on this subject. So as Scott said, this event is on geo-blocking. In this first part is on non-audiovisual media services in the digital single market. By non-audiovisual, we mean basically everything except film. Everything except audiovisual, film, TV, and the like. So music, books, games, software, everything else. So let me say a little bit about the policy background to this research that we did. In digital media, it's often assumed that anything is just a click away. So any product anywhere in the world, you just click and you get access to it. In reality, this death of distance hypothesis has been vastly overblown on the internet, and we see distance matters still a lot, and especially borders still matter a lot. There are some legal obstacles to crossing borders and getting access to a product in another country, but there are mostly commercial obstacles to that, because the sellers, the distributors, the producers themselves impose restrictions on that, on cross-border trade. When the Commission published its digital single market strategy in 2015, one of the basic principles that it posed was to say, to eliminate discrimination based on country of residence and nationality. That means applying the single market principle as we know it in goods, services, labor and capital to digital services online as well. And several initiatives were proposed. And a lot of that has focused on the reform of the copyright regime. Because indeed it was perceived that, and there are indeed a number of legal obstacles or trade costs that make it more difficult to trade goods or to access goods across borders. In the pre-digital area, this was not so much an issue because transport costs make it difficult to arbitrage between different countries. It was always possible, of course, to take the train from Brussels to Paris and go to the Virgin Megastore and buy your CD and your music and your video there, but transport costs compared to the value of the product are very high, so few people would do that. In the digital area, if producers or sellers want to prevent people from accessing a store in a particular country, the only way they can do this is by geo-blocking, by taking technical measures so that people who live in Brussels can no longer buy at the Virgin Megastore online in France. And so hence this idea that the Commission came up, the policy initiative, to do something about this geo-blocking in order to realize this principle of eliminating discrimination based on country of residence. And so a proposal was launched for goods and services. As Scott mentioned, we worked actively on the impact assessment of that. And everything outside goods and services was left aside in that proposal. Now, then the Parliament came back when the Parliament was discussing this and said, but what about digital media? Shouldn't we include that in the proposal? Shouldn't that be covered as well? And so it was decided to split this up in two parts because the audiovisual part is supposed to be covered under the reform of the copyright review of the copyright directives and related directives. And so we are not discussing that, at least not in this session. It will come in the next session. And here we focus on non-audiovisual products, music, books, and games. So one of the questions is, to what extent is this geo-blocking linked to the copyright regime? And that's a question. There's always this interference between copyright and geo-blocking. Copyright, of course, is a territorial right. It's defined on a country-by-country basis. And the management of these rights can be territorial as well, but is not necessarily so. And that depends from product to product. For books, for instance, book publishers usually have rights worldwide. But they can split up these rights. They can give specific rights to other republishers. Happens, for instance, often for translations of books, where the translator gets a specific right as well. Or it may happen, for instance, in English language books, where UK publishers and US publishers divide their parts of the world. In music is probably one of the best examples where, in the past, in the pre-digital area, let's say, rights were handled on a very territorial national basis. You had copyright management societies or collecting societies in each country, and they managed the rights for the artists and the publishers of the music. But what we have seen under pressure, under market pressure and technology pressure, when iTunes started with its iTunes music store, there was market pressure to say, hey, this system has to become more efficient. We cannot go to each and every country and try to organize these rights in every country. It's too much work. Why don't we do that on an international basis? And what you see in music, for instance, is the emergence over the last 10 years of these large, what I would call copyright hubs, international organizations where national collecting societies get organized in international societies and bring their repertoire together there, and then start managing these rights from an international perspective. And so that has led to a vast increase in cross-border availability in music over the last couple of years. And we have collected some evidence on that. For other things like software, for instance, in games, this cross-border issue is not really an issue. What is, however, an issue is not so much the legal side of acquisition of rights, but the commercial exercise of rights. And here, the rights holders may decide, although they hold worldwide rights or rights for the whole European Union, they still want to segment the market and give licenses on a territorial basis. And that's what we see happening, for instance, in audiovisual, in films, where film producers, film studios usually hold rights worldwide. There are some exceptions to that on the margins, but by and large that is the case. And then they segment this and give licenses for specific territories. Now that's a question of private contracting. That's not an issue of the law as such. And so it may be that competition policy can intervene in that and say you cannot restrict this. And for instance, the current ongoing Sky TV case that we'll be talking about in the second session revolves around this. So rights holders may prefer geographical segmentation. So what did we do? We are economists, we are not lawyers in my team, we are empirical economists, so we look for data and we look for evidence. And what we did is we went to look for evidence on music, on ebooks, and on games. And we took the market leaders, stores, in each of those domains. That means in music downloads, we went to the iTunes stores in the 27 member states. Music streaming, we looked at 16 streaming services in the EU with various geographical coverage. For ebooks, we looked at Amazon, the market leader in Europe on online book distribution, ebooks distribution. And for games, we look at Sony PlayStation, which has is the largest market player in online games. And what we did, for instance, for music, we took the top 100 albums on iTunes, and albums usually contain on average about 10 songs, so that means 1,000 songs. We took the top 100 in 40 different genres of music, so that makes about 4,000 albums altogether in 27 countries. So altogether we had a sample of more than 30,000 songs, actually. And we looked to what extent are these songs available in the 27 member states, and to what extent are there price differences between the member states. In music streaming, of course, we couldn't get a catalog of all the music that's available on streaming services, so we simply looked at price differences. For Amazon ebooks, similar, we took the top 100 books. Amazon has only 6 stores in the EU, but also has the US worldwide store that it's also accessible from the EU. And for Sony PlayStation, we took 25 they have a store in 25 different member states. So what did we find? First, on cross-border access. We distinguish between cross-border access and cross-border availability. Access is basically equivalent to Mode 2 in WTO GATS services trade. And access means that a consumer can go to another country and buy the product there. And what we find is that for these media products that we're looking at, it's generally blocked, the cross-border access. There are a few exceptions to that, but it's generally blocked. However, when you scratch a little bit deeper in most of these online stores, it's often easy to get around this blockage and to go actually to a store in another country. On Sony PlayStation, for instance, you can open an account in a Belgian store, but you might as well open a new account in a British store and a French store or wherever. And that's very easy, but it takes additional effort by the consumer. So there are, let's say, cross-border trade costs for the consumer to go to another country. And then the question is, what is the incentive to engage in those trade costs, unless you can find a product there in another country that you could not find here, or you can find it at a lower price. So the variety effect, is there a different product? Or the price effect, can I find it at a lower price, may be a motive for consumers. The fact that you can rather easily circumvent these geo-blocking constraints means that distributors seem not to be overly worried about a limited amount of cross-border access. It doesn't seem to be a legal issue where they say, if one consumer buys one product across the border, we are violating the law. It's just that they want to limit that trade. So, and why the only reason we can really think of is for geo-blocking is price discrimination. I'll come back to that. Second is, we looked at cross-border availability. So to what extent are the products that are available in one country store also available in another country store? And that question, of course, is important also from a consumer perspective, because if I find basically all the products that exist in my own country store, there's no need to go to another country store. And so we find that generally cross-border availability is very high for all these media products. In Amazon ebooks, for instance, 98% of all the ebooks that you find in the French store, for instance, you can also find in the Dutch store or in the UK store or in the Amazon.com store. So basically, all the books that are available on Amazon, with a few exceptions, you can find in any of those stores. Spotify streaming, we found cross-border availability to be around 96%. Now, how did we do that? Because we didn't have access to the catalog of Spotify. Well, what we did is we took a number of songs that were not available on iTunes in a specific country store and checked whether those songs were available on Spotify in that country. So as you see on iTunes, cross-border availability is about 90%, which is reasonably high. But on Spotify, it's higher because some of the songs that are not available in the iTunes store in a particular country are available on Spotify in that particular country. So by doing some calculations, we came to the figure of 96%. Of course, this is an estimate. This is not really hard evidence so far. Spotify, of course, has the data to tell us, and maybe we'll hear later onwards. On Sony PlayStation, we find that for the older generation of PlayStation 3 games, availability is 80%, not bad. For PlayStation 4 games, it's around 90%, so very high. Now we come to the third aspect, price discrimination, price differences between these country stores. And there we find some interesting results. On Amazon, for instance, ebooks, we find that 26% of all the books have different prices across stores, which means that basically 3/4 have more or less the same price anyway, so it's still rather high. But most of these price differences are due to rounding off of prices in other currencies, because if you go in EU euro-denominated stores only, you find a much lower figure of price differentiation, only about 16%. But there is some aspect of country income levels and the popularity of a book in a country as well. The higher it is up on the ranking, the higher the price. Let me first go to iTunes. On music, we found very similar results. About 11% of all the songs are sold at different prices, of which 9% at higher prices and only about 2% at lower prices. And again, it's mostly related to country incomes and to the popularity of the music. In economic jargon, we would say, as economists, it's related to income and price elasticity of demand. And we've actually done some estimates on the iTunes store that show this. Sony PlayStation, surprisingly, we found very little price differentiation across the stores, very small. And almost all of that differentiation was related to price changes, to exchange rate, rounding off. You don't do the direct conversion from pounds to euros, you round it off to the nearest convenient figure and so on. So not really active price discrimination, I would say. So what would be the potential impact of lifting geo-blocking restrictions? That, of course, is the billion-dollar question. There are two impact channels that we looked at. One is variety. If geo-blocking restrictions would be lifted, all of a sudden, as a consumer, you have access to all the variety available all over Europe or anywhere in the digital single market. But since variety is already quite, cross-border availability is already quite high for most of these products, the additional variety effect would be small, not very high. With respect to price discrimination, you may want to go to another store still. Although the product is available in your country, you may want to go to another store because you can buy it at a lower price there. And so this arbitrage is stimulated by price differences, but it can also be limited by trade costs. And at the moment, since you can circumvent the geo-blocking restrictions in most cases, well, the question is, are you willing to incur the costs of opening a new account, switching your account in order to gain 1 or 2 euros on buying an ebook in another store, for instance? So trade costs still remain an issue. We were not able to do really the estimates because we didn't have access to consumer demand data as such. Well, I'll come back to this in a second, but basically we did not have those data. So what could be the welfare effects of lifting geo-blocking restrictions? Theoretically, this effect is ambiguous. There can be positive, it can be negative. And as long as you haven't done the calculations with the exact data, you cannot find it out. The effect on sellers, the net result of price and variety might be negative because the variety effect will be very small. But we assuming that sellers have done their calculations for geo-blocking and price discrimination correctly, they will be at the moment in a revenue maximizing situation, and anything that diverts from that will bring them to a lower level of revenue. But on the other hand, for consumers, there may be a positive effect, of course. They can do price arbitrage, they can gain a little bit on the variety side. And the question remains, of course, for consumers is to what extent they will engage in this arbitrage, because even after you lift the geo-blocking restrictions, sellers may still get involved in building up transaction costs between country stores. You can, for instance, limit a product by giving it only, by requiring that the mode of payment is only a locally and nationally used means of payment. But even that is now forbidden under a new European regulation on payment restrictions online. But you could also, for instance, do product variety. What we find, for instance, in iTunes stores is that there are different versions of songs and albums. And in some country you find one version, in another country you find another version. For music, of course, there are no translated versions, but in film, for instance, you can have different subtitling. A film in Polish, if it's not subtitled in another language, is unlikely to be consumed to a large extent in many other countries, unless by Polish residents who happen to be resident in that country. So that limits the degree of cross-border price arbitrage and trade, and makes it more difficult for consumers to access these goods. So even after lifting geo-blocking restrictions, I think there are still possibilities for sellers to restrict that arbitrage trade cross borders. Some empirical results. We've done some work on goods, and Scott already mentioned this for the geo-blocking study, where we show that for electronic products, for instance, like smartphones and computers and laptops and so on, if you lift geo-blocking restrictions, it would have a positive welfare effect, both for consumers and for the sellers and producers, because they would sell more, despite the fact that there would be price convergence. We did a similar study for music, where we look at the variety effect only, not the price effect. And we find that if you lift geo-blocking restraints on music, the likely effect is to be positive both for music producers, sellers, and for consumers. So, just a conclusion to stop here. I think policymakers are in a dilemma situation here. They could have two reasons to say we want to lift geo-blocking restrictions on these audiovisual media. The first reason would be to say it's an economic principle. So it's a positive economic impact, both for consumers and for producers. But as long as we don't have access to the evidence, that makes it very difficult. In iTunes, we could do this. In goods, we could do this because we had data on cross-border sales and on domestic consumption of these items. In the game stores, in e-book stores, on Amazon, we do not really have data on consumption. So in music streaming, we don't have access to data on consumption, so we cannot do the calculations. Another position that policymakers could take is to say, we take it as a matter of principle, as we have done so often in the single market. We say, as we have announced in the digital single market policy, as a matter of principle, there should be no discrimination of consumers based on country of residence or nationality. irrespective of the economic evidence. And not sticking to that principle, I think, also entails risks, because if you let the principle slip this one time, there's a risk that, of course, you get increasing prevalence of first-degree price discrimination on the internet, that you get personalized pricing. What, if you drop the principle, what would stop an online retailer from saying, I make a price distinction between somebody who lives in Schaerbeek and somebody who lives in Uckel. Presumably people in Uckel have a higher income and have a lower income price elasticity, so I'll sell it to them at a higher price and those in Schaerbeek at a lower price. How can you stop that? So I leave it here and open for discussion. Happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Martens. I think it will be best if we take questions at the end so that everyone has a chance to speak. Our next intervention will be by Marine Elgrici, the Head of Public Policy Europe for Spotify. So perhaps you can also elaborate a bit on to what extent those titles are common. You would probably know.
Yeah. Yeah, of course, I will come back to that. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share Spotify's views on geo-blocking. And I think that when we talk about geo-blocking, it's really important to understand what is the goal, the ultimate goal of geo-blocking, is to remove barriers for consumers in Europe to access the content and the services they want. And including copyright is really like, okay, we should remove barriers for consumers to access the music and the music services they want in Europe. And I think we agree on this principle because at Spotify, since the very beginning, when we launched Spotify in 2008, the music industry was completely collapsing because of piracy, because there were barriers for consumers to access the music they want. They wanted to have access to all the music in the world, like piracy allowed them, and so that's why we built a product that would be better than piracy and would remove all those barriers for them to have access. And the first barrier we removed at Spotify is the access to the content, is to ensure that everyone, whether you're a French national or an Italian national, anyone wants to have access to all the music available in the world. And that's what we did at Spotify. So we have a catalog of more than 30 million of songs that is actually, like, to get back to your point, it's not 96%, it's actually 99% of the catalog that is the same. So we have less than 1% difference between a catalog from one member state from the other member state. And maybe the second thing I would love to get back to is that I think that there is this common belief that there is international music hubs and we just go Spotify and negotiate with one person and then we get the rights for the whole world. Where we have actually deals with more than 30,000 labels and as many publishers. So it's not as simple as that. There is, to operate in a country, there is not like one license. It's a bundle of licenses that are like pan-European, regional, national, and it all depends. You have all sizes of publishers, off sides. So it's, I think that because it's working well, and because we managed to solve the problem of the license, of some of the license in music, there is this common belief that, okay, it must be easy. It's not easy. We have like teams working on that. We have like deals with publishers. We have deals. So and music is actually obeyed to territorial copyright. It's a bundle of things that makes it available all over the world, but it's a very complicated issue, and if you have questions, I'm happy to take them, but just to remind that. The second barrier we removed as well is the barrier of location. Make sure that we needed to be successful to be a global service. So today Spotify is present in 60 markets, and in each market we offer the same service. So we basically ensured that we would have the same service for everyone in each market. So regardless of where you're based, the other thing that was important regarding location is to ensure that people can listen to music when they're traveling or temporarily located abroad. And since the very beginning, before the portability regulation, Spotify always provided full portability for consumers. So you can travel with your music, you can listen to your music when you're abroad. And I think that the third barrier for people was the price. And as you said, Spotify price differs depending on the country because we adapted our price to the cost of living in each country. So for example, in Hungary, it costs $4.99 to subscribe to Spotify, $6.99 in Portugal, $9.99 in France or in Belgium. So we really adapted the price of Spotify and the cost of living. And one thing that is important when you talk about adapting price, we also adapt the price we pay to rights holders. So it's not like one license where we pay the same price for each for the content. We pay a different rate when a song from Drake is streamed in Poland than when it's streamed in France, because the price of Spotify is different in those countries. And, you know, removing all those barriers, that's why the music industry is back to growth today, because we created a product that was good for consumers, and because it was good for the consumers, today the growth of the music industry in Europe is by 4%, 5.6% at the global level, and it's been the second year in a row in an industry that was completely devastated, and especially in countries where lower costs, with lower incomes, where we have a real growth and a real music industry that is emerging thanks to streaming services. And I think, you know, it was important for me to remind all that, because when we think about including music services in the scope of the geo-blocking regulation, my question is that what would be the benefit for consumers? What are the benefits for consumers? We believe that consumers already have access to the content of their choice. They already have access to more than 40 services across Europe, providing more than 43 million of songs without discrimination on the catalog. And so we believe that there is great benefits. But what we see, it might be unintended negative consequences. Due to this complex licensing framework, it would completely disrupt the way we license, and it would be very hard to determine what are the requisite rights because like imagine that for one song in France you can have one right holder. The right holder would be different in Poland. It would be different in Germany. So who should we pay? So that's one question. It's like how it would disrupt this complex licensing ecosystem. But I think that the most negative and unintended consequences, like how it would drive price upward. And it would lead to price harmonization, because the leading countries in the music industry are the countries where prices are higher and not the countries where prices are lower. So yeah, that's, I think, my overview on geo-blocking and music services.
Thank you. A lot of interesting thoughts there. Actually, when we get to the discussion, I'll be interested in some back and forth between you on whether these differences between countries are welfare enhancing or welfare detracting. I think that could be an interesting argument. Is it Ramsey pricing or is it something else? Let's come back to that, though. Let's cue that up, if we might, so that we can give everyone a chance to speak. Our next speaker will be, again, Fabian Pagman. He's the co-president of EIBF, and he also manages a family bookstore of his own. So with that, over to you, Mr. Pagman.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for the presentation this morning, Mr. Martins. I think very interesting insights there. Indeed, I am the co-president of the European and International Booksellers Federation. On that aspect, I am here on behalf of European booksellers. And besides that, indeed, I run a bookshop of 2 stores in the Netherlands, family business, medium-sized, independent company. And when the Commission launched the Digital Single Market strategy, we as EIBF responded very positively, very enthusiastic, because we thought this was fully compliant and fully in line with the strategy and the ambition of many booksellers in Europe who also want to develop and further embark on the development of the digital market and to see how we can embrace the possibilities that Europe has for us. So as we further developed that and we've looked at the geo-blocking, we think that the geo-blocking as the proposal as it is right now is certainly in line with this further development, but is coming a little bit too early in the way it's presented right now for booksellers in Europe. It's very important to realize that the e-book market is very nascent still. It's very small. In many European countries, we're talking about a market share of between 2, 3, 4%. And it's very important when this market is so small that we push booksellers to embark on this market, to invest, to innovate, and to make put in the money that is necessary to further develop this market. That is obviously in the interest of the readers, of the consumers, because in that sense we have a complete common interest that we want to achieve a maximum availability at the most interesting price for as many readers and consumers in Europe. And the proposal that is at stake right now, and including books into the geo-blocking regulation, we think could be very harmful for pushing new booksellers to embark on this market, and could also eventually lead to booksellers who are presently active in the sales of e-books to refrain, to pull back from that market. Simply because of a few simple reasons. If booksellers are pushed to sell their e-books throughout Europe, it would mean that they have to implement all kinds of technicalities to make this work. It means further investments, and I can assure you that there's no bookseller in Europe that makes a single euro profit on the sales of e-books. I don't know about the case that you've presented for your investigation. Obviously, that's not a bookseller, but as booksellers, we have the interest of thriving on the cultural diversity in Europe. That's what we work for, and we are happy to make the investments that are necessary for that. But at this stage, it is very important that we do not harm those willingness to make those investments. And if we impose further regulations and impose further technicalities to be implemented, that could be very harmful. We actually think that would be very harmful. Technicalities such as making available payment solutions only through credit card. Well, if you're already making a loss on a sale and you have to pay another 3 or 4% to an American PayPal or a credit card company, well, we can all count, so we all know what that means. But also all the technicality aspects that you have to check where the buyer is located, the VAT implications, all those aspects are putting up extra thresholds for new booksellers to enter the market, or for existing booksellers to stay in that market. Also, as a booksellers, we also often don't have the rights to sell cross-border. You already pointed it out in your presentation, but I think it's very important to understand that unlike in the physical world where you're selling a product, we are often not selling a product. Many of the e-books that are being sold are under so-called agency contracts, so we're only selling access to an e-book, and are very often in that sense limited to all sorts of restrictions, and also that could be restrictions to territoriality. I think those are some of the main aspects. What pointed out in your presentation is that you said that the variety will, to a certain extent, increase when the lifting of geo-blocking is in effect. And we think, as I stressed out at first, that actually the other way the exact opposite could happen. That actually the variety of offering and the variety of books and the availability of ebooks will be lesser, will be lower. There will be less ebooks available in Europe for consumers once the geo-blocking is imposed, simply because there will be less companies offering ebooks. And also, as a final element, we think that it is in the interest of the European consumer to have as much choice as they can have. So a wide variety, but also many companies that offer ebooks. So you have price competition, and in that sense, you will automatically also have price pressure. And if we do not stimulate the entrance of new players into the market, but leave it to the American big players, then you will have not a full working market with a wide variety of offers, and that will eventually be harmful for the readers and the consumers. So we very much ask you to stimulate the entrepreneurship, to stimulate booksellers to invest, to embark on this market, not by imposing new regulations right now. And we ask you to postpone that for a number of years, for 5 years, so we have the time to further develop this, further invest it, to build a market, to build perhaps a profitable situation, and from there on we can also work with the geo-blocking regulations.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pageman. So at this point, we've heard from Dr. Martens, we've heard from two members who represent various industry sectors that would be potentially affected, impacted by the rules. Our next speaker will be Augustine Reina, the digital team leader of BEUC, who will be presenting us more with what does this mean for all of us? What does this mean for us as members of the public, as consumers?
Thank you, Ula. Thank you very much for the invitation. Hope it's better now. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here to discuss this very important subject for companies, the industry, the creative sector, but also for consumer alike. I really appreciate in the first presentation the political overview, or from where we come from and where we are heading to. And in this regard, my organization has been very supportive for many, many years since the establishment of the single market, in favor of a single market that delivers to consumers. And I would say that this is the first time that the political leadership of the European Commission started really looking at the single market from the consumer perspective and saying what do we need to do to bring the benefit of the single market closer to the citizens. We have done it, for example, with roaming. This is a very important success of the European Union. Portability is another internal market instrument and a copyright instrument, we don't have to forget that also brings tangible benefits to consumers. And the third important proposal is the geo-blocking one. Now, the Commission, when they came forward with the proposal, decided to include, but not to include non-audiovisual services in the scope of application, which it shows a lack of consistency from the point of view that if we need to explain to our consumer the Commission proposal and how this would impact, for example, the access to non-audiovisual services like ebooks and music services, or even audiovisual services as such, it becomes very complicated, very difficult, because part of the regulation applies to these type of services, while the main article, in this case, the article related to access, doesn't. So basically, for a consumer, that means that you can go to the website, you cannot be rerouted, but you cannot buy, you cannot access what you're looking for. So here we have an important question to address, which means for the European legislator to make a policy choice. Either we include them or either we exclude them. But we cannot have a halfway solution in the regulation. Now, from a consumer perspective, I will advocate for the inclusion of these services. And this has to do to several consumer-related aspects. Despite the fact that there is a high level of availability, as you show, particularly in relation to companies that are present in several, if not all, member states, that is like Spotify or like Amazon. We have also the question of the availability of service providers. We don't want that all consumers, they just go to one specific company of reference, no matter how good they might be. But it's very important to have also choice in relation to the service providers. So perhaps you can elaborate later why the study did not include this other very important aspect of consumer choice, which is consumer's choice in relation to service providers. There are many outstanding barriers. That is clear. VAT is a very important one. For physical goods, parcel delivery perhaps is the main barrier to cross-border access and cross-border trade. But it is enough to say, okay, let's leave this for a future review or not. I would say it's not the case. This regulation, what it comes, is basically to clarify a principle that we already have in the Services Directive, in Article 20 of the Services Directive, the principle of non-discrimination. The problem with this rule, that was already in place for over 10 years, is that it was hardly enforced. Actually, it was never enforced. Consumers have the right to access and not being discriminated, but this rule was never applied in practice. So this regulation, when it comes to clarify what are the conditions for consumers to access services and also for companies to serve those consumers. And here is when it comes the principle of the single market, which I think is a very, very important aspect. It's not the most important of this discussion. In the single market, all companies benefit from all the freedoms. And this implies also giving something back to the single market as such, which is having their products available across the borders. And this doesn't mean eroding completely the principles of territoriality that are so important in copyright. As you say, copyright is a territorial right. But the single market and territoriality can coexist. The question is, what are the necessary legislative interventions that are needed to achieve that result? We have seen in the past, in several competition cases, these discussions, the tensions between the single market and intellectual property rights. And now, in this specific proposal, the first time we're really saying, okay, now it's time to overcome the differences, start looking at it from a case-by-case assessment, but really introduce an ex-ante measure. So in this regard, I think that the point on the single market principle is extremely, extremely relevant for developments of EU law in this regard. But then there is also the question, what will be the benefits for consumers? And I would agree that choice is a very important element to bear in mind. Choice not only in relation to the content that is available, but also choice in relation to the service providers. And I think this is an aspect that perhaps has not been closely or properly looked in the debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Augustine. And I think here what we hear is the tension between single market principles, consumer benefits versus other factors. I think those are all things we'll want to take up as we get into the discussion. I'd like to now turn the discussion over to Rosa Gräfin Thun und Hohenstein. She is an important member of the European Parliament. She has been the rapporteur for this measure, EPP. Since I've had the honor of knowing her for several years, I would also add she's a very fine public servant, very knowledgeable on these issues and hardworking. And with that, Over to you, Mrs. Toon.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I came a few minutes late, but I come straight from the aeroplane, which was almost not late, so I cannot complain. Of course, it's a discussion about single market and profits of the consumer, but of course also of companies. This is one world, those who consume and those who provide. Without one cannot exist and develop without the other. So I always, or our political group tries to see it as one, and the development of the companies is exactly as important to us as happiness and possibilities of access for the consumers. But we also discuss here, in fact, about, sorry to say so, about life as such. I think that, especially when I hear your fears, it's as if we didn't see how rapidly this digital world changes, how rapidly the digital single market changes, and how extremely high the needs and expectations are, for both for companies and for sellers. Companies want to have more buyers, more clients, earn more money, and the consumer wants to have access everywhere. And in fact, it's pretty impossible to explain why this market, the single market in Europe, in the digital single market, still consists of 28 different units. This, in fact, is impossible to explain to the consumers, who complain more and more about it, because what we also must see is that they communicate with each other and see those differences in offers and in prices, that they travel, that they work abroad, etc., etc. And this fragmentation is a growing problem. Secondly, I don't really understand what this outcry is, why this panic? Because to me it is extremely convincing that there are many reasons why people will remain truthful to their provider to which they're used, which they know, where they have already been buying for years. And if there is a certain percentage that moves to another provider in a different country, I mean, if there is competition until now never was really harmful. I understand that some don't want it, but it never was really harmful. And thirdly, what I would like to stress is that in this regulation, we listened very carefully to companies. And of course, I understand this fear that especially small companies, if they have to sell, be it also e-books, to various countries, etc., they have to introduce new instruments, and it's difficult and costly, etc. But there is a very exact description of what is targeting and non-targeting. And if they don't target, they sell according to their laws and regulations in their own countries. And it doesn't give them, or it doesn't, it's not more complicated than if they were selling to the citizens of their own country. So what I would like to say is that fear is not a good advisor. We cannot be afraid of every change, but see it as a challenge that gives to the companies more chances to develop, more clients, earn more money, etc. We work in the European Parliament on facilitation, harmonization of VAT, etc., so that many of those problems will, I hope, soon disappear. And this is one of those changes. There are rapid changes. On licensing, as you know, we didn't tackle on copyrights. Copyrights, there will be a different procedure on copyrights, but in this regulation, it doesn't change anything on copyrights and on licensing. So this is just a sort of reasonable attitude, I would say. Reasonable attitude that gives the companies a bigger field of actions, and I would encourage them very much to use it. And the consumer will not be treated as an object that is redirected, blocked, limited, gives him a chance of a real choice, like in the physical world. In the 21st century, we cannot divide those worlds. This physical and digital world today become more and more one, and you must have a choice as well in the physical world as in the digital world. I would very much. One more thing. If we talk about those different prices, I find it extremely artificial to differentiate prices according to country, because really the Skarbek and Ukl was a very good example, but I think also from citizen to citizen we can also differentiate prices. Some are rich, some are poor, within one country, within one city, etc. If we start differentiating like this, let's be consequent. Sell for a different price to you and to me. I mean, really. So let us see it a little bit with a fresh eye and try to.
It's already happening.
Yeah,
That
okay,
you and I
but do
pay
we
a different
want?
price.
Yes, but do we want to go into this direction, or
It's
do
already
we
happening.
want to have?
It's already out there.
But I don't want the client to be redirected, blocked, etc. So this client can have a choice, yeah? And then it will be very difficult to give you a different price and a different one to me, because I go to a different site where I am not blocked, where I'm not redirected, and find the same thing for a price which suits me better. So I find this those different prices according to countries an extremely artificial situation in our single market. And the last, maybe, as far as your research is concerned, I missed a little bit, or what I lacked is there was very little about applications, programs, software. This maybe I would be very happy if there is more about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Toon. Well, before we actually open for questions from the audience, I'd actually like to give Dr. Martins a chance to respond to two things. One is that last question on software, and the other is we've now had multiple comments on the question of to what extent is price differentiation a good versus a bad thing, implicit in country versus country, Ukla versus Skarbek, and again, one could perhaps make a Ramsey pricing argument. Whether that's a good argument or not, I'm not sure. But I really appreciate your views as an economist who's looked at this a lot.
Yes, please.
Okay, so some intermediate reactions before we open up to the audience. So to me, it more and more looks like this is not a debate about copyright, this is a debate about price discrimination. And that's what the real driver of this is. And if you further want to narrow it down, I think it's mostly a question of price discrimination in music streaming services, because that's where the real bottleneck in this debate is. On ebooks, I understand that there could be some arguments for small shops, but I'm not really convinced by your arguments, because payment charges to credit cards or PayPal you also have for local sales anyway. So VAT rates, indeed, it's difficult to find out what are the VAT rates applicable in different countries, but the Commission is setting up VAT clearance hubs now, and so that problem should soon be solved. You say there are vertical restraints. We are sometimes not allowed to sell a book cross-border, but basically these vertical restraints from your suppliers are illegal under EU competition law.
But it's something that we have to deal with.
But yeah, there's something you have to deal with. I understand that. But but coming back to the real issue. So what would happen if we lift geo-blocking restraints? Prices do not only go up; some will also go down. And so somewhere there will be an equilibrium price. And I agree with you that for music streaming, this would have repercussions for music artists and publishers as well, because you will, whatever price change is happening at the end user level, you will have to recuperate on the publisher side.
Publishers and record label.
Sorry?
We are not working only with publishers and record label.
Yeah. All the parties involved in that chain.
But it's really important.
Yeah.
There is like 6 different parties to pay for one song. Okay?
So what would happen? It's very hard to say where the price would stabilize in the end. And I think even Spotify doesn't know today where the price would stabilize if we would indeed lift geo-blocking restrictions. Some prices would go up, others go down. It all depends, and here's my economist view on that, to what extent there would still be some trade costs involved. Today, on the iTunes store, you can basically buy music in every country you want, but people simply don't do that, or do that on a very limited scale. And so I can imagine that for music streaming services, the apps you use to stream your music could be different from country to country. It could have a different language interface, for instance. And as much as I love Bulgaria, I would probably install a Bulgarian app for Spotify on my telephone and still buy a French or English language app for that. So even if that would cost a little bit more. So the question is, to what extent are there still possibilities for making cross-border trade difficult? And that will determine, and that is something we simply don't know at this stage.
Well, thank you, Dr. Martins. In the panel, let's try to keep one speaker at a time if we could. Actually, a point that Mrs. Toon just reminded me of, which I think is important, is we're talking here about geo-blocking somewhat in isolation, but it's part of an overall digital single market strategy, and so it's really it's part and parcel of all of these other initiatives as well, including harmonization and rationalization of value-added tax, efforts to reduce the cost of parcel delivery cross-border, harmonization, simplification of consumer rights. So a lot of these things are going on together. But we're dealing with one piece, and that's basically, just to keep it manageable, we have to deal with it that way. Now, with that, we've got about 20, 25 minutes available for questions, so we have time for the audience to jump in. And my colleague will be coming around with a microphone. I already see one question. As people ask questions, would you please provide your name and your organization?
Thank you very much indeed. My name is Wolfgang Pape. I'm with SEPS at the moment. I was in the commission beforehand. I would like to address a question to the representative of Spotify. You were very keen in saying 99% availability, but you didn't give any percentage at all on price differences. It was just mentioned Bulgaria seems to be very cheap. Could you quantify the price differences in terms of percentages, or what is the highest or lowest price within the EU? Thank you.
Let's take 3 questions before we move on. I see Bruno there. Please identify yourself. One in the back afterwards.
Bruno Basalisco from Copenhagen Economics. I have a question for Agustin. I think we've heard from Bertrand an intuition about what may be the interest of suppliers, that if they're doing price discrimination now, price differentiation, they may have a commercial interest, and we've heard some message on this. From the consumer angle, how easy or difficult is it to trade off and reconcile the different interests in different consumers that are in Scarbeck versus Uckels or different contexts and face different prices today? I think it's an interesting issue, and you must have a good overview of that. Thanks.
I see more, but we'll take the person in the back first. We'll come back to you in the next round, Fran.
Thank you. Marie Sellier from Vivendi. Just a big thank you for giving this clarity, this level of understanding of the real issue at stake. Thank you for the research and the data points. So if we focus on the real issue, which is streaming and the price, there has been very little discussion about the price elasticity of this type of content. It seems to me that you assume that content might be like a commodity and that it would obey the same laws. On the industry perspective, we are very reluctant to thinking this way. We think that consumer not only expect some pricing for a certain type of goods, but also they expect context more and more, and accuracy of delivering the right content to the right person at the right place. And this seems to be less and less obvious, that we will be able to build business models that will be accurate for consumers if we have no more of that flexibility. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let's give the panelists a chance to answer now. I think I'll give Marlene a first shot, since the first question was directed straight at her.
Thank you. I don't have the exact percentage of price difference between member states. What I can say is that in most Eastern countries and in Portugal, Malta, and Greece, prices are lower than Spain, but it's Spain, France, Italy, but it's really like, and also you have currency differences around among Europe, so I don't have the exact percentage, but let's say that there is maybe something like 20 or between 15 and 20 different prices in Europe. And I would like to get back on some of the comments you made, if it's okay, really quickly.
Sure. Why don't we allow the panelists to respond to each other while we're at it? Okay.
Sorry. Just about your saying that you won't you don't want to download a Bulgarian application and subscribe to Spotify in Bulgaria because you don't speak the language and you don't. So, but basically, you're Dutch, right?
Almost, right.
Yeah. Or whatever. I'm French. I'm knowing it's not a good example, but let's say MEP Tune is Polish and lives in Belgium. She would like to have access to Spotify in Polish. We let her have access to Spotify in Polish to change the language setting in Poland, because this is the way Europe works. There is not like only French living in France and wants to have access to the French language. And it would be sad to see the world like that. And it would be sad for us to limit everything that we have done to actually ensure that consumers can have access to the language they want, all the music they want, to make sure that they don't do cross-border access. We don't want to limit the service. We don't want to implicate trade costs for consumers to limit the cross-border access. And this is not the way Spotify or any music streaming services is changing, is thinking. We want to increase the choice and the availability for the consumers. And I think, sorry, Agustin, on your point on choice, I think there is like 40 different music streaming services available in Europe, all around Europe. So I think that there is like a variety of choice when it comes to music. I don't know about the other sectors, but when it comes to music, this is not only Spotify. We have a lot of competitors, and I think that there is access in every market for those services. And
not all of them price discriminate between countries.
Yeah.
Some do, some don't.
Yeah, so there is no problem.
Sometimes the major one all does, like when it's like Apple, Deezer, Google, and Spotify, the major one all do that. So I think it's good. And no, when it comes to music, you say that consumers are complaining. I would be very happy to see complaints from consumers about music availability in Europe and access to music services. Very happy. We have never heard any complaints. There is no evidence. There is no data, but we would be very happy to, because the way Spotify works, that we always listen to consumers and adapt our product based on consumer complaints. So if there is consumer complaints, and if there is consumer wills to access to music services, if there is some limitation that consumers are complaining about, we would love to hear it. We are very happy to have them. So I think I can go for ages, but I will stop myself because it's too late time.
I was thinking in the interest of time, it's a good point. Well, I would suggest, since a couple of the questions, both from the audience and also from these, seem to be pointed in your direction, why don't we give you a chance to respond next?
Like to respond.
I'm sorry, you already have the mic.
Yeah, it's true. Sorry. To your question on price discrimination, it's a very good question indeed. The starting point is that price discrimination is basically a market strategy technique to gain more customers. No, it's not that companies do it just for the sake of giving more to consumers, but to gain more customers. And then I would say that from your question, there could be other two subsequent questions. First, is price discrimination good for consumers? And secondly, is price discrimination legal in Europe? And the answer to both questions is sometimes yes, sometimes no. When price discrimination could be good for consumers is, for example, when you treat all consumers that are in the same category equally. And the same category does not, and how you define these categories of consumers is we will draw the line whether it's legal or illegal. For example, nationality, I wouldn't say that that's a category that you can use in order to apply price discrimination. Actually, it would be illegal under the treaty. But for example, students, under 26 years old, here they would pay less for trains than adults. So there are different types of price discrimination that address different needs of different categories of consumers. Now, when, for example, wouldn't be good for consumers, when the price discrimination is based on your browser history. And moreover, if you don't know that the price that you're seeing correspond to...
Is that legal?
That's the next question. Is it legal or not? And then we have to look at EU law, for example. One of the most important instruments that address this question is the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, which specifically addresses the question of information given to consumers that might be misleading either by action or by omission in relation to the price that you get. So if the price that you get is as a consequence of a technique which is, or the calculation of the price is based on your pricing history or whatever other technique is applied, might be considered as an unfair practice. So there is no one answer which is yes or no, but it really depends on how it is applied to different categories of consumers and how you define this category of consumers. Thank you.
Thank you. For the questions, did anyone else have something that you wanted to toss in, or should we take let's take the next round of questions then. So I see one from Yorios. I know Fran had her hand up on the last round, and then the gentleman in the back. That'll give us three. That'll probably take us to the end of the session, pretty close.
Hello, thanks for this interesting panel. I have one question for Marin. For Spotify, for example, that has, let's say, pan-European coverage, let us assume that tomorrow the European bodies agree to extend geo-blocking prohibition to streaming of music. How this will affect your business model? What will be the impact on consumers?
It's on a case by case.
So I'm Fran de Bruegel, European International Booksellers Federation. Fabian is my boss. Just more a comment, suggestion, more than a question. First, it seems to me from the discussions you have been having, for the last half an hour, that there are far more questions about price discrimination in the music industry than problems with prices in the e-book sector. So it seems to me, and it's a question maybe to the research center and to Mrs. Von Thun, without one willing to, of course, discriminate our friends from the music industry, and understanding very well that from a policy point of view, you want to talk about the non-audiovisual products. It seems to me that maybe there should be things to be reflected upon about the usefulness and the really pertinency, consistency of putting together music and e-books, because it seems to me that the issues at stake in the music streaming industry and the e-book market are completely different. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing, second comment is about your study, Mr. Martins. Well, your investigation was, of course, on the e-book leader market, Amazon. I think that might be useful, if I may, to go further than Amazon, because there are, 85% of booksellers in the EU and on the main leading markets which are present on the e-book markets, and they are present and they sell across borders. So limiting your study to Amazon, yes, it is the leader, but I think there is far more outside than Amazon. Thank you.
Thank you. And there was a gentleman in the back who just put his hand up. Matilda? Please identify yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, citizens. My name is Angelos Harlakis, Epafos Advisors. So we think that the problem is not the internal market, which sooner or later the whole issue will be settled. If we see the regulation of the Parliament, which is under the advice of the Commission, is a very detailed one. Of course, maybe it is needed, as the gentleman from the Pacman Bookshops has told, to assist a little bit the independent producers, music producers or other kind of stuff, the SMEs which are specialized in local cultural issues. But the main thing, the single market will be achieved sooner or later because of the values we have already chosen to follow. But the problem is the taxation. The pricing is an internal issue, it's a matter of competition. But the problem of taxation is for the external borders. The geo-blocking, I'm raising a question, the geo-blocking not for the internal market, which of course under the pressure of the interested parties of the industry and other cultural organizations will be resolved, but the problem is about the geo-blocking externally. There we are losing billions of euros because from China or from USA or from other countries they are entering in small amounts of payments goods which the European Union, the national states and the regional authorities, they don't get the benefit of the tax. We don't know, I asked the president in the DG Trade 4 weeks ago at the SEPS meeting, how much is the money we're losing from the profiling, from all this, they don't know, we don't have studies. If we have studies, these studies I think they are going to push the internal market problem which we are facing so that the single market will be achieved the soonest, and also it will raise the blocking of the external borders of the Union and the Mediterranean. And finishing, I'd like to speak about Google, for example, which I have lately working on the G Suite, which is a very new platform of Google. They charge on dollars, and they want me to pay in dollars, even though the cookies they are seeing on the robot platform that I am based in Brussels. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Excuse me? Yes, thank you very much for that. Actually, what I might respond for a second on that. Again, this is one of multiple measures that have been proposed. On the value-added tax side, the Commission, I think to its credit, has proposed measures to try to rationalize a rather strange system we've had in what's called the low-value consignment rule, which indeed means that small shipments from outside the European Union are often not taxed, even though the equivalent shipment within the European Union would be subject to value-added tax. There actually is some research on that. There's a report from Ernst & Young a few years ago. So it's not an unknown problem, but actually a complementary problem is one that comes up in postal economics, which is that the payments between national postal operators, terminal dues and inward land rates, can actually be more favorable for sometimes, especially for developing countries outside, like China, than for European merchants. So the combined effect is that Chinese merchants are often able to ship into Europe at lower cost than European merchants. So it's something that needs to be fixed. It's not a geo-blocking problem, but it's absolutely a problem. Why don't we start with Dr. Martens again, since several of those seem to be pointed in your direction.
I noticed only a few, but okay. First, the lady from Vivendi. You're absolutely right to point out that we should not look at these non-audiovisual and also audiovisual products as simply commodities with a price attached to it. There's a whole bundle of services built around this. And for the consumer, it's very important what sort of services he gets and where he gets it delivered, when and how easy it is for him or her to have access to this. And so definitely we do in our studies do not look at it only from a price perspective. We look at consumer demand, how much he favors a product or not favors a product, how interested he is in cross-border or not interested in cross-border, and so on. So we look at a whole bunch, a whole bundle of characteristics in our studies. On e-books, I think you're right to point out that we cannot put e-books and music in the same basket. They are different markets. They're different markets because the underlying copyright system is very different, but they're also different in the sense, for instance, that in e-books, there's a much longer tail of small online sellers than in music. We heard there are 40 streaming music streaming services in Europe, but there are thousands of online e-book sellers in Europe. And so it is a market that's still dominated by one giant, by Amazon, but where there are many more smaller sellers. And we should look at the issues that these small sellers confront. And so, yeah, we really need to look at to what extent are these cost issues of payments, credit cards, and all that. But I think the Commission is working also on that side separately to try to solve these issues. We have only looked at Amazon because it's impossible for us to look at these hundreds of online bookstores and design a robot that goes scrape the data there specifically for that store and then work out the analysis. So Amazon itself is a very difficult thing to do. One of the problems we faced when we were scraping the Amazon website is that they constantly change prices, sometimes more than once a day. And so in order to know what exactly the price of a book is, it's very hard. You have to go back frequently, take some sort of average price. And at one point we started talking to Amazon and say, what explains your price differences? We cannot make sense of these patterns. And they say, well, we don't know. Because what happens is our prices are set by our internal algorithms, and they go looking at what other online booksellers do in that country, and if one online bookseller that day all of a sudden lowers the price of that book, we try to follow. And secondly, we also constantly run online experiments with consumers, and depending on the information we find in your cookies, all of a sudden the price may change for you. And so our robot runs into these cookies as well, unless we clean them every time. And so it's very hard to know exactly what explains this pattern. And when you go to Amazon and ask them why that book is at that price at that moment, they say, well, we have to go and ask our own algorithm because we don't know. So that's what happens with online bookstores. We haven't looked at cross-border outside the European Union, so that's something that so far has been out of our limits. Just, if I may, one more comment on music streaming in general. Let's not call the company by name. If you would do price discrimination in the US between different states, for instance, say West Virginia is a poor state, we would put the price lower, and New York is a rich state and we'll put the price higher there, you would face uproar from your clients and your customers. While in Europe, the system, the legal system, the market structure allows you to do that. So the question, the fundamental question as a European, not as a Commission, as a European for me is this something that we should allow to continue? For saying that price discrimination in some cases may be beneficial for the companies and so let them do it? Or is this something where we say, no, this cannot be right in our European context? I have no answer to that question. I put these two questions at the end of my slides, but this for me is the fundamental question that we face.
And those are good questions. Well, over to Maureen for a second. You were asked what would happen to your business model, and I think you're also asked, is music the same as publishing? But you'll have to be brief because we need to close.
Yeah, so it's a very good question on the impact on the business, and I think that there is a number of things that we need to resolve. First thing, what does that mean to have the requisite rights? That's as it was drafted in the Parliament text. What does that mean? Does it mean that if we have the right for one song in Germany and in France, which should allow cross-border stream? That's the first thing we need to resolve. The second question is like, who to pay? The rights holders are often very different from one member state to the other member state. So where are we paying if like a French user is streaming music in Poland or in Hungary? Are we paying the Hungarian right holder or the Polish right holder or the French right holder? At which rate are we paying it? Are we paying it at the Polish rate or are we paying it at the French rate? So that's the question we need to solve. And that is a very complicated question. And no, I would say that the third thing, if we solve those questions, I would guess that if we see an impact and some forum shopping, we would have to increase the pricing. We have very thin margins. The countries where Spotify is at the lower price are not countries where we're making profit. So we would unfortunately have to raise those prices in those countries. The countries that are the most profitable for us are obviously Germany, Sweden, France, and those countries. So that's the way we see it, if it has to happen. And I think the question is like, are you a federalist? And this is another question, and I think that's one new idea. And about price, like the price of bread is different in France than it is in Poland, I assume. So it's not something we invented at Spotify. It's the way the world works.
That doesn't have to.
Okay, so I think we'll need to move over to the other panelists and give them a chance to either to respond to the last question or make very, very brief closing remarks. Mr. Pogman, anything to add?
What I would like to say is, just to repeat that, I think competition is in the interest of the European reader, European consumer. Please, I ask you, do not kill this nascent market of thousands and thousands of European booksellers who are eager to enter the market or already participating in this digital market. I can tell you that these European booksellers are profitable, they pay taxes, and they employ people. Do not take this nascent market that is important for them. They're very eager to also be part of the digital single market. Do not take that away from them by putting up new thresholds. Give us some time. That is all we ask. And in line with the remarks of my director, I think it would be very, very smart to make a distinction between music and books.
And actually, the general economic perspective I'd add is that when we talk about societal welfare, we're talking about the sum of producer welfare and consumer welfare. They're both important.
Of course. I have my microphone. Very briefly, so we don't have a crystal ball. We cannot predict how markets are going to behave. We cannot predict how consumers are going to behave. That's another very important element also to bear in mind, that whether there will going to be a massive migration to countries with lower prices, or whether consumers will tend to stay in their own national markets. Having said that, what I think it's important, first of all, to have clarity in EU single internal market law, what are the rights and obligations of all parties concerned. And as a matter of principle, taking the statements made at the beginning, if you're a company and you benefit from the EU freedoms, you have also obligations under EU law, and complying with the principle of non-discrimination is one of them. So we cannot anticipate what's going to happen, but based on experiences in the past, for example, on the many cases there have been in relation to parallel imports of goods, the tendency is that, on the contrary, there will be more choice and lower prices. So if we take that as a reference, I think that the approach of the European Parliament is the right one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Augustine. And with that, last words of wisdom from Mrs. Thun.
If we continue developing our market in the direction that everybody reads the books in her own language that are accessible or to him or her within this country, what about within the country of origin, let's this becoming more and more European. I think exactly those who produce non-audiovisual and also audiovisual content must realize that they create also our way, or help to create our way of thinking, seeing the world, etc. And we try to open this world, at least here in Europe. And we should all look for solutions that enable us access to culture, literature, music, but later also, I hope, films, etc., of other countries. Otherwise, we will never become one well-functioning continent. This is the political side of it. But now, as far as, and you say we shouldn't put new thresholds on especially small sellers, we lift those thresholds. The attitude is exactly the opposite. We lift the barriers, and if small sellers are afraid to sell to other countries, you force the consumers to buy from Amazon only. And I understand that the sellers also want to have their broader clientele. So the practice of what the Commission and Parliament proposes is not against the small sellers. I pay your attention once again to this targeting and non-targeting. This doesn't put additional burden on the shoulders of the small sellers. And as far as music is concerned, I also made a small research, and there were at least 10% of music users, buyers, who said that they were geo-blocked and it disturbed their functioning. And among others, if I remember well, more or less all DJs. They would like to have access, they travel, they practice their job everywhere, and they suffer very much from geo-blocking. So thanking you very much for this panel and all exchanges that we keep on having. I would urge once again, let us think really about the future and what we can do in this changing world. Without this, Europe will be outplayed by other bigger players in the world. So in this direction, we should really all act together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And with that, we can close this panel. I'd appreciate a moment of appreciation for our panelists.